Taekwondo champion challenged Chuck Norris, unaware he was facing a six-time world karate champion. John Matthews was a name that had started to gain attention in the martial arts world. He wasn't born into a family of fighters or athletes. In fact, his early years were pretty average. His father worked as a mechanic and his mother was a schoolteacher. But from a young age, John was drawn to the martial arts. There was something about the discipline, the strategy, and the strength that fascinated him. He started taking Taekwondo lessons at the age of 12, and from the moment he stepped onto the mat, he knew he had found his calling. As John trained, he quickly realized he had a natural talent for Taekwondo. His kicks were faster, his movements sharper, and his focus more intense than most of the other students in his class. Over the years, he climbed the ranks, earning his black belt at the age of 18. He wasn't just good, he was exceptional. By the time he turned 22, John had already won several local and regional championships. His aggressive, high-flying kicks had earned him the admiration of his peers, and he quickly became the go-to fighter at his Taekwondo dojo. His coach, Master Han, recognized John's potential early on. "You've got the talent to be great," Master Han would tell him, "but you must remember that true strength comes from control, not just power." John, being young and full of confidence, didn't always listen. He knew he had the speed, the agility, and the technique to defeat anyone who stood in his way. In his mind, he was already a champion. As John's reputation grew, so did his sense of invincibility. He would often tell his friends, "No one can touch me in the ring. I'm the best, and I'm going to prove it." He would boast about his victories, always reminding people how quickly he could win matches. But there was one name that kept coming up in conversations about the best martial artists: Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris wasn't just a legend in the martial arts community, he was a global icon. His martial arts prowess had made him famous both on and off the screen. Movies, television shows, and books had made Chuck Norris a household name, and his reputation as a tough, unbeatable fighter was legendary. He was the kind of person John had heard about but never really paid much attention to. To John, Norris was just another fighter who had his moment of fame. John believed that Taekwondo, with its high kicks and dynamic movements, was superior to other martial arts, like karate, which Chuck Norris practiced. One day, while chatting with some friends at the dojo, John overheard a conversation about Chuck Norris. "Did you hear that Chuck Norris is still active, even at his age?" one of his friends said. "I heard he's unbeatable." Another friend added, "Yeah, he's the six-time world karate champion. His skills are incredible." John listened to the conversation, rolling his eyes. He didn't think much of it. "Karate, Taekwondo, it's all the same thing," he thought. "No one can touch me in a fight. If I ever faced Chuck Norris, I'd show him what real martial arts looks like." It wasn't long before John's pride began to grow. His friends teased him, joking that he would never be able to beat Chuck Norris. "Why don't you challenge him?" one of them asked, half joking, half serious. John didn't take it as a joke. Instead, the thought started to stick with him. "Yeah, why not? I'll challenge him. I'll prove that Taekwondo is superior," John said, his voice brimming with confidence. At first, it seemed like a simple idea, something to boast about. But as the days went on, John couldn't stop thinking about it. "If I can beat Chuck Norris, my name will be etched in martial arts history forever," he thought. The more he thought about it, the more determined he became. He began researching Chuck Norris's background, his achievements, his fights, and his incredible career. He learned that Chuck had been a six-time world karate champion, had served in the military, and had become a global star. Chuck Norris was not just an actor. He was a martial artist who had dedicated his life to perfecting his craft. Yet none of this seemed to faze John. He still believed that his skills in Taekwondo would be enough to take down someone like Chuck Norris. As the challenge grew more serious in John's mind, he began preparing himself like never before. He started training harder, pushing himself to new limits. Every day, he would wake up before dawn to run 10 miles, then spend hours at the dojo perfecting his kicks, his footwork, and his speed. He studied Chuck Norris's fights, looking for weaknesses, convinced that he could find a way to beat him. One day, after a particularly grueling workout, John sat down with his coach, Master Han. "Master Han," John said, catching his breath, "I'm going to challenge Chuck Norris. I'm going to prove that Taekwondo is the superior martial art." Master Han looked at him, his expression serious. John, you have the talent, but you must understand something important. Fighting is not about proving who is the best. It is about understanding your opponent, respecting them, and learning from them. Chuck Norris is not just a fighter, he's a master of his craft. If you challenge him, you must do so with respect. But John wasn't listening. His mind was made up. He thanked Master Han, but he was already planning how he would make his challenge. That evening, he posted a video online addressing Chuck Norris directly. Chuck, I'm challenging you to a fight. I'm John Matthews, Taekwondo champion, and I know I can beat you. I'll see you in the ring. Within hours, the video went viral. The martial arts community erupted in a frenzy. Some people laughed, others were outraged, and many were eager to see how this bold young fighter would fare against the legendary Chuck Norris. John's challenge had been set in motion, and there was no turning back. After John Matthews posted his video challenging Chuck Norris, the martial arts world went into a frenzy. Everywhere John went, people were talking about it. Some laughed at him, thinking he was just some overconfident young man who had no idea what he was getting into. Others, however, respected his boldness and were eager to see the match unfold. The whole situation was causing quite a stir, and soon the story hit the news. John's phone rang constantly. Coaches, trainers, friends, and fans all reached out, asking if he was serious about the challenge. John, you have to be careful. Chuck Norris is a living legend. This isn't some local tournament, one of his old friends warned him. But John, feeling more confident than ever, replied, I'm ready. I've trained for this my whole life. Taekwondo is the best martial art, and no one can stand up to me, not even Chuck Norris. The comments on his social media were a mix of encouragement and criticism. Some people, especially his supporters, cheered him on. Go show them what Taekwondo can do, they wrote. But others, particularly martial arts veterans, expressed concern. Chuck Norris has years of experience, not to mention the titles to back it up. Are you sure this is a good idea? John ignored the warnings. He was convinced that his speed, power, and agility would be enough to defeat the man who had become a symbol of toughness around the world. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for Taekwondo to prove that it was superior to other forms of martial arts, especially karate. As the days went on, the event was hyped up more and more. News outlets picked up the story, and even entertainment sites had articles about the upcoming showdown. It wasn't just a fight. It was a battle of egos, martial arts philosophies, and reputations. John Matthews, the rising Taekwondo star, versus Chuck Norris, the six-time world karate champion and Hollywood action legend. People were excited to see how this would play out. John's training intensified as the fight date drew near. He started pushing himself harder, determined to perfect his kicks, increase his speed, and develop new techniques that would catch Norris off guard. His coach, Master Han, remained skeptical, but he didn't try to stop him. He could see the determination in John's eyes, but he also knew that some challenges were better left unspoken. Nevertheless, Master Han continued to teach him, emphasizing control, focus, and discipline. Remember, John, true strength isn't just about how hard you hit. It's about how well you understand your opponent. But John had no time for these lessons. In his mind, he had already figured it all out. Chuck Norris was old, and John believed that age would give him an advantage. I've got the speed. He's just a guy who has been around for too long, John thought. He focused less on his strategy and more on his belief that his Taekwondo skills would be enough to overwhelm Norris. John's family wasn't sure how to react. His mother, who had always supported him, tried to give him a word of caution. John, don't get too caught up in the fame of this challenge. You've trained hard, but remember that respect for others is just as important as your skill. Be careful. But John, wrapped up in the excitement, dismissed her concerns. I'll be fine, Mom. I'm going to win. I just need to focus on what I'm good at. As the big day approached, the pressure mounted. John began to feel the weight of the challenge on his shoulders. His friends would joke with him, saying, You've already won, John. You've got the whole world talking about you. But deep down, he knew that it wasn't enough to just be talked about. He had to win. The thought of losing was unbearable. In the days leading up to the fight, John couldn't sleep. His nerves were on edge, and his confidence began to waver. Every time he closed his eyes, he thought about Chuck Norris. What if Norris wasn't just a Hollywood tough guy? What if the stories about him were true? What if he was a truly unstoppable force? The pressure started to eat at him, but John refused to show weakness. "I can do this," he kept telling himself. "I just need to stay focused." Meanwhile, Chuck Norris, who had been aware of the challenge for a few days, wasn't fazed by the whole situation. He had been in much tougher situations during his time as a fighter. He knew that John Matthews was young, talented, and full of ambition, but Norris had seen it all. He had been a world champion multiple times, and he had fought in tournaments all over the world. He was a master of karate, but his skill set also included several other martial arts techniques. In fact, Norris had trained in a variety of disciplines over the years, from Taekwondo to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and had a reputation for being a well-rounded fighter. But Chuck Norris wasn't one to boast about his accomplishments. He had never been interested in proving himself to anyone, and he certainly didn't see this challenge as anything more than a young man's attempt to gain attention. Norris was much more concerned with maintaining his reputation as a humble martial artist, someone who practiced discipline, respect, and control. He had long ago stopped seeing martial arts as a way to prove his superiority over others. To him, it was about personal growth and learning from each experience. However, despite his calm demeanor, Norris's team reached out to the organizers of the event, making it clear that he would be participating. He wasn't interested in the media circus surrounding the challenge, but he also understood that the fight was important for John. Norris knew that this could be a defining moment for the young Taekwondo champion, and he respected John's courage. The night before the fight, John barely slept. He tossed and turned, his mind racing with thoughts of the battle ahead. What if Chuck Norris is everything they say he is? He thought. What if I can't handle it? What if I'm not good enough? These doubts plagued him, but in the end he forced himself to calm down. I can't back out now. I've made my decision. On the morning of the fight, John put on his Taekwondo uniform, the familiar fabric comforting him as he prepared for the biggest challenge of his life. He couldn't back down now, no matter how many doubts crept into his mind. He had made a commitment, and it was time to face the consequences, for better or worse. As John made his way to the venue, he could feel the eyes of the world on him. The anticipation was high, and the pressure was unlike anything he had ever experienced before. He was about to face a living legend, a man who had shaped the martial arts world. But John Matthews, full of pride and determination, wasn't going to back down. He was ready. Or so he thought. As the days leading up to the fight passed, John Matthews could not escape the growing pressure. The more he thought about his upcoming match with Chuck Norris, the more the weight of it all began to sink in. He had always admired the idea of becoming a martial arts legend in his own right. But now, facing a man who was already a living legend, John realized that he was stepping into a much bigger arena than he had anticipated. Chuck Norris was not just an actor in action movies or a pop culture icon. He was, in the eyes of the martial arts world, a true master. His name was synonymous with discipline, strength, and respect in the martial arts community. It wasn't just his fame in Hollywood that had earned him his place in history. It was his accomplishments in the ring that had made him a 6-time world karate champion. John had spent his entire life training in Taekwondo, believing it to be the superior martial art. To him, karate was just another form of fighting, one that relied too much on tradition and not enough on speed and power. But as the days passed, John's confidence in his own abilities began to falter. He found himself wondering, what if Chuck Norris isn't just an actor who got lucky in a few fights? What if he really is everything they say he is? John had heard the stories, of course. Everyone in the martial arts world knew about Chuck Norris's legendary career, but John had always brushed them off. He'd grown up seeing Chuck Norris's movies, but to him, they were just that, movies. He didn't think much about the man behind the scenes, the one who had earned his titles through years of grueling training and countless hours spent honing his craft. But now, with the challenge looming, John started to research Chuck Norris's career, diving deeper into his past. Chuck Norris had grown up in a tough neighborhood in Oklahoma, and from a young age, he had been introduced to martial arts. His journey began in the world of Tang Soo Do, but it was his commitment to mastering karate that really set him apart. He eventually earned black belts in several martial arts, including karate, Taekwondo, and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Norris didn't just train to fight, he trained to understand the art of combat in its purest form. His philosophy was simple: Martial arts was about self-discipline, control, and respect for others, not about showing off or trying to prove who was better. It wasn't long before Chuck Norris made a name for himself in the competitive world of karate. He won his first world title in 1968 and went on to claim 5 more championships over the course of his career. But it wasn't just his championship titles that earned him respect. It was his ability to adapt to any situation and fight with grace and control that made him a feared competitor. He had faced some of the toughest fighters in the world and emerged victorious every time. His techniques were not just fast, they were precise, honed over years of practice and understanding the physics of combat. Norris's reputation wasn't based on flashy moves or brute force. It was based on his ability to read his opponents and counter their every move. John was starting to realize just how much he had underestimated Chuck Norris. He had always thought of him as just another martial artist, someone who was famous for being in movies. But now, as he learned more about Norris's background, he saw that the man was far more than that. Chuck Norris had dedicated his life to martial arts, and he had earned every bit of his reputation through hard work and discipline. The more John learned, the more he found himself in awe of Chuck Norris's legacy. There were stories of Norris training for hours every day, pushing himself beyond his limits and never stopping until he had mastered a new technique. He would spar with some of the best fighters in the world, not just to prove himself, but to learn from them, to refine his own skills. It was clear that Chuck Norris's approach to martial arts was not just about winning, it was about the pursuit of excellence. For Norris, fighting wasn't just about beating your opponent. It was about learning from each experience, growing as a fighter, and constantly pushing yourself to be better. He had spent years learning from his mistakes, perfecting his techniques, and adapting to new challenges. It was this constant pursuit of improvement that made him the champion he was. John had always been proud of his Taekwondo skills, but now, facing Chuck Norris, he realized that there was more to martial arts than just winning tournaments and earning medals. He understood that Norris had something more than just technical ability. He had the wisdom of experience, the calmness of a master, and the respect of his peers. The more John thought about it, the more nervous he became. He had spent so many years focusing on his own strengths that he had neglected to truly understand what it meant to be a complete martial artist. Norris's ability to remain calm and composed under pressure was something that John hadn't fully grasped until now. It wasn't just about being the fastest or the strongest. It was about mastering yourself, controlling your emotions, and understanding your opponent in a way that allowed you to make the right move at the right moment. As the fight drew nearer, John realized that he was about to face someone who had spent decades perfecting his craft, someone who had fought the best and emerged victorious time and time again. Chuck Norris wasn't just a name, it was a symbol of everything that John aspired to be in martial arts: disciplined, focused, and unwavering in the pursuit of excellence. But even as John's nerves began to creep in, his pride refused to let him back down. He was a champion in his own right, and he had earned his place in the martial arts world. He couldn't back out now, not when so many people were watching, not when he had already made his commitment. He would go into the ring with everything he had, and no matter the outcome, he would show the world what Taekwondo was capable of. At the same time, Chuck Norris remained calm and collected. He had heard about the challenge, and he knew that this was just another fight in his long career. He didn't take it personally. For Norris, the fight was about more than just winning. It was about understanding the art, respecting his opponent, and giving his all as he always had. He knew that John Matthews was a talented young fighter, but he also knew that there was no shortcut to mastery. And when the time came, Norris would meet him in the ring, not as a Hollywood icon, but as a martial artist. The day of the fight finally arrived, and the tension in the air was palpable. It wasn't just any fight. It was the showdown between John Matthews, the young and confident Taekwondo champion, and Chuck Norris, the legendary 6-time karate world champion. The event had been promoted as one of the biggest martial arts spectacles in years, attracting crowds from all over. The venue was packed, and the atmosphere was electric with excitement. John arrived at the arena early, his mind racing. His heart pounded in his chest, and despite his best efforts to stay calm, he could feel the nerves creeping in. It wasn't the physical preparation that was bothering him, it was the weight of the moment. He had never faced someone like Chuck Norris before. The thought of going up against a man who had been in countless tough battles, who had earned his place in martial arts history, was both exhilarating and terrifying. As John waited backstage, he watched as Chuck Norris entered the arena, surrounded by his team and his supporters. Norris was as calm as ever, walking with a quiet confidence that only someone who had been through it all could possess. The crowd cheered as Norris made his way to the center of the ring, his reputation preceding him. He didn't need to speak to command respect. His presence alone was enough. John took a deep breath and tried to steady his nerves. He knew this was his moment. He had trained for this his entire life. Taekwondo was his passion, and he was determined to show the world that it was the best martial art. But as he looked out at the sea of spectators, the weight of the challenge hit him harder than ever. This wasn't just about a fight, it was about proving something. It was about showing that a young Taekwondo fighter could stand toe-to-toe with a living legend. The bell rang, signaling the start of the match, and the crowd erupted in excitement. John stepped forward, his body moving into position. His legs were tense, his hands clenched into fists, ready for the first move. He had studied Chuck Norris's fighting style, watched videos of his previous matches, and had practiced his own techniques, hoping to find an opening. But as soon as the fight began, it was clear that John's plan was not going to be as simple as he had hoped. Chuck Norris, though much older than John, moved with the grace and precision of someone who had spent a lifetime mastering his craft. He was calm, his eyes never leaving John's movements. John launched himself at Norris with a series of high kicks and fast footwork, aiming to strike quickly. Taekwondo was known for its speed and powerful kicks, and John relied on these strengths to take control of the fight. His kicks were fast, sharp, and powerful, but Chuck Norris seemed to anticipate every move. Norris blocked each of John's attacks effortlessly, his movements smooth and controlled. John tried again, this time coming in low with a spinning kick aimed at Norris's legs. But Norris sidestepped, his reaction time so quick that John barely saw it coming. John's frustration began to build. He had expected his speed to give him the upper hand, but it seemed that Chuck Norris was always one step ahead. The fight continued at a blistering pace, with John pushing himself harder and harder. Sweat dripped down his face, and his breathing became heavy. He was starting to realize that Chuck Norris was not just another opponent. The older man's ability to read his every move, to remain calm under pressure, and to counter each attack with such precision was something John had never experienced before. He began to doubt himself, wondering if he had made a huge mistake in challenging Norris. But there was no turning back now. John had to keep going. He threw himself into another series of attacks, hoping to break through Norris's defenses. With a powerful roundhouse kick, he aimed for Norris's head. It was the move he had perfected over years of practice, and he felt certain that this time it would land. But once again, Norris was ready. In a fluid motion, he ducked under the kick and launched a counterattack. Before John could react, Norris's hand was on his shoulder, and with a swift turn, he effortlessly threw John to the mat. John hit the floor hard, his breath knocked out of him. He lay there for a moment, stunned by the speed and efficiency of the move. The crowd gasped, and John's mind raced as he scrambled to get back on his feet. He had never been thrown so quickly in a fight before. It was as if Chuck Norris had known exactly what he was going to do before he even did it. As John rose to his feet, Norris stepped back, giving him a moment to recover. The crowd was silent, waiting to see what would happen next. John wiped the sweat from his brow, his mind now focused on one thing. He couldn't let Norris's mastery get into his head. He had to dig deeper to find that inner strength that had always pushed him to succeed. The fight resumed, and John tried to clear his mind. He took a few deep breaths, his body still aching from the fall. He knew that if he wanted to win, he needed to change his approach. He couldn't just rely on brute force and speed. He had to be smarter. He had to understand Norris's movements, find the rhythm of the fight, and wait for the right opportunity. For a few moments, the two fighters circled each other, sizing each other up. Norris was calm, still, but his eyes never left John. John, on the other hand, was trying to get a read on his opponent to figure out what his next move should be. He launched into another attack, but this time he changed his strategy. Instead of going for a direct strike, he feigned a high kick and then dropped low, aiming for Norris's legs. But once again, Norris anticipated the move and smoothly evaded it, countering with a quick strike to John's midsection. The force of Norris's strike took the wind out of John's lungs, and he stumbled back, gasping for air. John had never felt this overwhelmed before. He had always been able to rely on his speed and power, but now, facing Chuck Norris, it felt like every move he made was futile. Norris wasn't just faster or stronger. He was smarter, more experienced, and in complete control of the fight. John's frustration boiled over, and in a moment of desperation, he launched himself at Norris with everything he had left. But this time, Chuck Norris was ready. With a swift movement, Norris sidestepped John's attack and locked him into a hold, his arm around John's neck, his grip unbreakable. The young Taekwondo fighter struggled, trying to free himself, but it was no use. Norris's hold was firm, and with a few more seconds the fight was over. John tapped out, signaling that he had been defeated. The crowd erupted into applause, not just for Chuck Norris's victory, but for the incredible display of skill, respect, and discipline that had been shown by both fighters. John lay on the mat, breathing heavily, his mind racing. He had been humbled, but in that moment he realized something important. It wasn't just about winning. It was about understanding the art of martial arts, respecting your opponent, and knowing when to fight and when to learn. Chuck Norris helped John to his feet, giving him a nod of respect. "You've got potential, John," he said quietly, "but there's always more to learn." John nodded, his pride momentarily set aside. He had come to the ring to prove something, but in the end, he learned a lesson that he would carry with him for the rest of his life. As John Matthews stood there, his breath heavy and his body aching, the reality of the situation began to sink in. The fight was over, and he had been thoroughly outclassed by Chuck Norris. The crowd's cheers seemed distant in his ears as he struggled to catch his breath. He had expected to prove himself, to show the world that Taekwondo was the superior martial art, but instead, he had been humbled. The fierce pride that had burned so brightly in him before the fight was now replaced by a sense of exhaustion and frustration. John's mind was racing. How had it happened? He had trained so hard, prepared so thoroughly. He had studied Norris's every move, planned his attacks with precision, and yet nothing seemed to work. Chuck Norris had moved like water, fluid and untouchable. Every time John tried to land a strike, Norris was already one step ahead. It was as if Norris had anticipated every move before it even happened. Chuck Norris, however, had already stepped back to give John some space, a quiet acknowledgement that he had nothing to prove. He didn't boast about the victory. He simply allowed John to gather his thoughts. The older fighter was calm, composed, and respectful, exactly what John had been taught to be, but had failed to live up to in the heat of the moment. As John slowly stood up, his legs still shaking from the intense exertion, he felt the weight of the loss more than ever before. "You okay?" Chuck asked, his voice gentle but firm. John nodded, wiping the sweat from his face. He couldn't find the words to respond at first. The shame of losing to someone so much more experienced, someone whose skill had seemed almost effortless, was overwhelming. But then, a deep realization began to settle in. He had entered this fight with an ego, believing that his speed, his Taekwondo techniques, and his youthful energy would be enough to overpower a man who, to him, was just a legend. But now, standing there, John understood something fundamental about martial arts and about himself. "I didn't expect this," John finally muttered, the words coming out like a confession. "I thought I was ready. I thought I could beat you." Chuck Norris gave him a small smile, one that showed both understanding and respect. "That's the thing about martial arts," he said. "It's not about being ready in the way you think. It's about understanding your limits and respecting your opponent. It's a lifelong journey of learning and growing, not just in skill, but in character." John looked at Norris, searching his face for a hint of mockery, but there was none. Instead, Norris's expression was one of quiet wisdom, as though he had been in this position before. It was something John had never fully understood, what it truly meant to be humble in the face of defeat, and to learn from it. All of a sudden, he felt like he had a long way to go, not just as a fighter, but as a person. He had spent so many years focused on his own achievements that he hadn't fully grasped what it meant to be a complete martial artist. To him, it had always been about winning, about showing the world that Taekwondo was the best. But in that moment, he realized that there was so much more to it. It wasn't just about proving something. It was about the respect you showed to your craft, your opponent, and yourself. As the crowd continued to cheer, John couldn't help but feel grateful for the opportunity, despite the loss. He had entered the ring thinking he was already a champion, but now he saw that true champions were made through humility, discipline, and an openness to learn from every experience, win or lose. John turned to Chuck Norris, his voice quieter now but filled with sincerity. "Thank you," he said, "for showing me what it really means to be a martial artist." Chuck Norris nodded, placing a hand on John's shoulder. "You've got heart, kid. That's the first step. Now it's time to listen, to learn, and to grow." John didn't know how to respond at first. The words felt so simple, but they carried so much weight. He had always thought of himself as a fighter, someone who could win any battle with enough speed and skill. But Norris had shown him something deeper, that martial arts were about more than just the fight. They were about the journey, the discipline, and the constant pursuit of improvement. As John slowly walked off the mat, he felt a shift within himself. He had been knocked down both physically and mentally, but for the first time he felt ready to truly learn, to embrace the lessons that came with both victory and defeat. He knew it wouldn't be easy. It wasn't just about winning the next fight. It was about becoming the kind of person who could respect the process, who could approach martial arts with the kind of humility and wisdom that Chuck Norris had demonstrated. In the days that followed, John's perspective on martial arts and life changed. He returned to his dojo, his mind still buzzing with everything he had learned. He spent more time reflecting on his losses than he had on his victories, recognizing that each failure was an opportunity to learn and grow. He started to train not just for the next competition, but to understand the deeper philosophies of martial arts, learning from different styles and masters, not just focusing on his own strengths. Master Han, who had always taught him the importance of balance and respect, noticed the change in John. "You're different," he said one day, watching John practice. "I can see that you're starting to understand what it really means to be a martial artist." John smiled, a feeling of peace settling over him. "I think I'm just starting to understand the journey," he replied, and it was true. The fight with Chuck Norris had been a turning point, but it was also the beginning of a new chapter. John Matthews wasn't just a Taekwondo champion anymore. He was a student, someone who had learned that mastery was about much more than just technique. It was about respect, humility, and the willingness to learn from every moment, whether it was a victory or a defeat. In the end, John Matthews realized that the greatest lesson he had learned wasn't about fighting Chuck Norris. It was about learning to respect the journey of martial arts, understanding that the true measure of a fighter wasn't in their record, but in how they approached every challenge with an open heart and mind. The days following the fight were filled with reflection and change for John Matthews. As he walked away from the arena, still sore from the match, he couldn't help but feel a strange mix of emotions. He had lost the fight, and yet, in some ways, he felt like he had won. The experience with Chuck Norris had opened his eyes in ways he never expected. It had been a humbling experience, but it was also a moment of personal growth. John had entered the ring with pride and arrogance, but he left with something far more valuable, a deeper understanding of what it truly meant to be a martial artist. For the first time, John realized that martial arts wasn't just about defeating an opponent. It wasn't about who could land the most powerful kick or who could score the fastest victory. Martial arts in its purest form was about respect. It was about discipline, self-control, and the continuous journey of learning and improving. And it was clear to him now that Chuck Norris wasn't just a skilled fighter. He was a master who had dedicated his life to understanding the art of combat, not just in the ring, but in every aspect of his life. As John made his way back to his dojo, he reflected on the lessons he had learned. The fight with Chuck Norris had been a wake-up call. He had come into it believing that his speed, his youth, and his Taekwondo skills were enough to defeat anyone. But what he had encountered was something entirely different. Norris had taught him that true mastery wasn't about relying on one's strengths alone. It was about understanding the balance between strength and technique, between confidence and humility. It was about knowing when to attack and when to step back, when to push forward and when to let go. In the weeks that followed, John began to train with a renewed sense of purpose. He still focused on his Taekwondo techniques, but now he also dedicated time to learning about other martial arts disciplines. He trained in karate, Brazilian jiu-jitsu, and even some traditional forms of kung fu. He sought out mentors and instructors who could teach him not just how to fight, but how to think like a fighter, how to read an opponent's movements, how to stay calm in the face of pressure, and how to truly understand the art behind every move. One of the first things John did was reach out to Chuck Norris. He knew that he had a lot to learn from the man who had humbled him, and he wanted to show his respect. After the fight, Norris had given him some words of advice, and John realized just how much those words had meant. He wrote a letter to Norris, thanking him for the fight and for the lessons he had learned. In the letter, he expressed his desire to continue growing and improving, and asked if Norris would be willing to mentor him in some way, to guide him on his journey. To John's surprise, Chuck Norris responded. He wrote back, offering his encouragement and support. Norris told him that he had potential, but that the real work was just beginning. "Martial arts is a journey," Norris wrote. "The more you learn, the more you realize how much there is still to learn. Keep training, keep pushing yourself, but always remember to respect the art, your opponent, and yourself." Those words stuck with John, and he carried them with him every day. He wasn't just training for the next match anymore. He was training for personal growth, for a deeper understanding of himself and the world around him. It was no longer about proving who was the best. It was about becoming the best version of himself. As the months passed, John's training began to pay off. He became more focused, more disciplined, and more aware of the nuances of martial arts. His Taekwondo skills continued to improve, but so did his ability to read a fight, to think strategically, and to stay calm under pressure. He learned to be patient with himself, to recognize that failure was not the end, but a part of the process. John also became more involved in his community, sharing the lessons he had learned with younger students at his dojo. He taught them not just the techniques of Taekwondo, but the philosophy behind the art. He emphasized the importance of respect, humility, and perseverance, just as Chuck Norris had taught him. John had once been the confident young fighter who believed that winning was everything, but now he was the teacher, guiding others on their own journeys. The story of his fight with Chuck Norris became a part of John's legacy, but it wasn't just about the loss. It was about what came after. John had learned that true strength came from within, from understanding his own limitations and pushing past them. The fight with Norris had been a turning point, but it was just one moment in a much larger journey. And every day, John continued to walk that path, with humility and respect guiding his every step. As time went on, John's reputation in the martial arts world continued to grow, but this time it wasn't just because of his victories. It was because of his attitude, his approach to the art, and his willingness to learn. He had gone from being a cocky young fighter to a humble, wise martial artist who understood that there was always room to grow. He had earned the respect of his peers, not just through his skill, but through his character. One evening, as John sat in his dojo reflecting on everything he had been through, he received a letter from Chuck Norris. The letter was short, but it carried a powerful message. "I've been watching your progress, John. You've come a long way. Keep going. The journey never ends." John smiled as he read the letter, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. He had been challenged by Chuck Norris, and in doing so, he had been given the greatest gift of all, a lesson in humility, respect, and the true meaning of martial arts. It wasn't about who was the fastest or the strongest. It was about the lifelong journey of learning, improving, and always staying true to the art. As John looked out into the dojo, he knew that his journey was far from over. But now he had a new understanding of what it meant to be a martial artist. He had learned that the greatest victories came not from defeating others, but from conquering oneself. And with that knowledge, he was ready to continue his journey, one step at a time.